They ran out of flour, then fuel, then hope, but they still cooked. In the burned-out kitchens of Europe, after rail lines were bombed and ration books turned to ash, families didn't wait. They adapted. With no stores, no supplies, and no outside help, wartime civilians crafted meals from whatever remained. Root vegetables, boiled grains, foraged weeds. Not because they wanted to, but because no one was coming. Chickens were gone. Bread was a memory, and even salt had become currency. So mothers stirred soups with no meat, baked cakes with no sugar, and made fireless meals on cold brick floors. These weren't recipes. They were strategies, each one born from necessity and preserved in silence. Today, we measure calories. Back then, they measured survival. These are 9 meals WWII families cooked, with no rations, no stores, and no help. Number 1, Walton Pie. The problem was meat. Not just scarce, non-existent. In Britain by 1941, beef was gone, pork was rationed to ounces. Chicken had vanished from markets entirely. Civilians couldn't wait for livestock. They had to feed entire families on what little remained. Root vegetables, scraps of oats, and wartime imagination. Hunger didn't pause for planning. So came the solution. Walton Pie. A meatless, storeless, ration-free dish invented not by chefs, but by necessity. It was named after Lord Walton, Britain's Minister of Food, and promoted across the country as a way to survive the shortages. But unlike other propaganda recipes, this one stuck because it worked. Walton Pie wasn't a pie by tradition. It was boiled vegetables, potatoes, carrots, parsnips, turnips, whatever grew in local soil, cut into chunks and simmered with leeks or onions in salted water. Oats or rolled barley were added to thicken the broth, absorbing liquid and extending calories. No butter, no meat, no stock, just boiling water, vegetables, and time. The filling was then poured into a deep dish and topped with a crust. Not from flour, but mashed potato, sometimes mixed with powdered milk if available. This crust wasn't flaky. It was heavy, soft, and survival-focused. There was no baking powder, no eggs, no precise measurements. Women stirred with instinct. Children peeled vegetables that came from backyard gardens or bartered sacks. In some households, mustard powder or chopped herbs were added, not for flavor, but to mask the repetition. When food fatigue sets in, even color could give morale. But Walton Pie wasn't perfect. Without protein, it couldn't build strength. Without fat, it couldn't sustain warmth. For families in freezing cottages or blackout shelters, this meal filled stomachs but not bones. Still, it did something more important. It bought time. It kept people upright when the collapse was close. It carried mothers through days when the stores were closed and the ration cards were worthless. Walton Pie became more than a recipe. It became a ritual, served quietly, reheated endlessly, and remembered by name long after peace returned.
It reminded everyone that survival didn't need luxury, just resourcefulness,
just a flame, just the will to keep eating when everything else was gone. Would you cook this if stores closed tomorrow? Tap save. This one's worth remembering. Number 2, depression cake, war cake. When the sweetness disappeared, they didn't stop baking. Eggs were gone, milk dried up, butter became black market gold. But civilians still needed warmth, something to lift a room when the cold settled in and morale collapsed. So they created a new kind of cake. Not soft, not rich, but real. A war cake, a depression cake, a dessert without luxury, made to keep hope from starving. This wasn't cake in the modern sense. There was no frosting, no cream, no flour dusted with sugar. Instead, it started in a pot. Housewives boiled water with dried fruit, usually raisins, apples, or prunes, then stirred in brown sugar or molasses if they had it. The mixture simmered slowly, releasing natural sweetness from the fruit. Once cooled, they added a handful of flour, a pinch of baking soda, and sometimes a little vinegar to mimic the rise lost without eggs. Lard or oil stood in for butter, but only if they had it. No milk, no eggs, no butter, no problem. The batter was poured into makeshift tins, coffee cans, dented baking pans, even repurposed ammunition boxes lined with paper. It was baked low and slow, often in communal ovens, fireplaces, or the back of wood stoves where coal was scarce. What emerged wasn't fluffy. It was dense, chewy, slightly spiced, and resilient, just like the people who made it. But the war cake wasn't about taste. It was about presence, having something sweet when everything else was bitter. In shelters under blitzed-out cities, a slice was passed like a gift. In orphan homes and refugee camps, it became celebration food. Birthdays, weddings, and farewells, marked not by frosting, but by the fact something still rose from the oven. Its limits were clear. It didn't nourish deeply. It didn't last long. But it made meals feel human again. It gave the illusion of normal when everything else had been bombed or bartered away. Even its name, Depression Cake, was a reminder that life had dropped but not ended. Mothers passed it on. Daughters memorized it. It became a recipe folded in aprons, not cookbooks. A dessert from a time when sweetness had to be earned, not bought. No eggs, no milk, no butter, just memory. Boiled, baked, and barely sweet. Would this feed more than hunger? Share if you'd try it. Number 3. Potato soup. Skin-on method. When war stripped kitchens bare, potatoes remained. No meat, no milk, no flour. But in fields riddled with shell casings and gardens flattened by boots, potatoes still grew. In basements, huts, and shattered tenements, civilians turned to the one food that didn't need preservation, didn't need luxury, just dirt, fire, and time. And so they made soup. Not as a meal, but as defense. Against hunger, against cold, against giving up. This wasn't creamy, it wasn't smooth, it had no cream to give. The potatoes were scrubbed, not peeled, the skins kept for fiber, for calories, for nothing wasted. Chopped roughly, they were boiled in rainwater or well water with whatever else could be found. A sprig of leek, a wilted stalk of celery, or the bitter white end of a turnip. Salt was rare, pepper was luck. Most often there was just heat and starch. Sometimes onions were added, if scavenged. If someone had saved a knob of fat or a dollop of lard, it was melted first, used to fry the vegetables before water was added. This simple step brought aroma to rooms that hadn't smelled like food in weeks. If dried herbs survived in a tin, they were crumbled in. But often it was just boiling, boil long enough, stir slow enough, and even a potato yields flavor. And when there was milk, powdered, tinned, or bartered, just a spoonful stirred in could change the mood of an entire shelter. For children, this soup was sometimes the only warm thing they touched all day. For elders, it was the difference between standing and sitting down for good. But it wasn't a full meal. It had almost no protein. It didn't hold you long. Still, it had its purpose. It warmed my hands. It gave something to sip when the wind howled outside and the windows were boarded shut. And it used what couldn't be wasted, the skin. In most recipes, the skin is discarded. In war, it was precious, holding the nutrients the body needed most. Across Austria, Germany, Poland, and France, this soup was made in silence, stirred over fire bricks, served in tin cups. It didn't fill every gap, but it stopped collapsing. It reminded people that even the simplest crop, treated with care, could offer one more warm breath before the cold crept back in. Would this bowl matter more than flavor? Tap follow. The next method goes deeper. Potato pastry pie flour was gone, but the oven still worked. In war-ravaged homes from Glasgow to rural Slovenia, when sacks of flour ran out and bakeries stood in ruins, people didn't stop baking. They changed what baking meant. They turned to the last dependable crop in their gardens, potatoes, and from them they made crusts, heavy, imperfect survival crusts, the kind you couldn't find in books, only in hunger. These weren't pies of celebration. They were wartime staples built from boiled potatoes mashed by hand, pressed together with a pinch of salt, a spoon of oil, and whatever crumbs of flour or oats could be spared. There was no gluten for stretch, no butter for flake. This pastry was dense, dry, and entirely functional. The filling? Whatever was left. Boiled cabbage, grated carrots, sautéed onions if there was grease. In rare cases, a scrap of lard or meat was added, but that was celebration. Most often, it was vegetables, shredded, layered, salted lightly, and wrapped beneath or inside the potato dough. The pies were formed by hand, baked on slate or tin sheets, and eaten the same day. They didn't store well. They didn't need to. Families in the Midlands and Carpathian villages made these pies weekly, sometimes daily, because they worked. They stretched scraps. They warmed rooms. They filled the house with something other than silence. And most importantly, they required nothing modern. No yeast, no milk, no firewood beyond a small flame. But the limits were clear. These pies offered bulk, not nutrition. They sat heavy in the stomach, but light in protein. Still, they bought time. Enough to search for the next root, the next egg, the next ration that might arrive if the trains ever ran again. And for children who hadn't seen bread in months, even a rough crust of potato offered joy. Something to tear, to hold, to eat warm. For mothers who had nothing to give, it meant giving something. This wasn't baking. It was survival molded by hand. No rolling pins, no precision, just instinct, passed down in flourless kitchens. If your flour vanished tomorrow, could you make this work? Save this method. One day, it might save you. Number 5, rice and raisin pudding. When dessert disappeared, they improvised hope. With no chocolate, no cream, and no bakery shelves to turn to, civilians made sweetness from what didn't spoil. In bombed-out cities and border villages, they stirred together rice, raisins, and water, not for luxury, but for relief. This was rice pudding, but rationed, reimagined, and survival first. The ingredients were simple because nothing else was left. Rice was boiled in water or reconstituted powdered milk when available. Raisins, if families had saved them, were stirred in for their sweetness, their calories, their memory of better times. Sometimes a spoon of sugar, sometimes none. Some added margarine or lard if they had it. Others flavored it with a pinch of nutmeg, clove, or cinnamon, leftover spice from a forgotten tin. The result wasn't rich, but it was warm, and it gave something more important than taste: morale. The dish required no oven, just a pot, a flame, and time. In households across the Balkans, France, and Britain, it was often made in the late afternoon, simmered slowly as families returned from work brigades or hours spent foraging. It was served in enamel bowls, sometimes stretched with bread or mashed root to bulk the portions. It was the closest thing to comfort many would see all week, but it wasn't filling. The rice gave bulk, not balance. The raisins gave sugar, not substance. Still, it mattered. It mattered in shelters where candles burned low. It mattered in basements where children hadn't smiled in days. It mattered because in a world of gray broth and boiled roots, something slightly sweet meant memory, meant presence, meant someone had cared enough to stir a pot slowly, just to lift the mood. In some regions, this pudding was wrapped in cloth and steamed instead of boiled, a slow-cooked parcel of softness hidden in ash-heated pots. It lasted for a day or two. It traveled well. And, for families displaced by war, it became the dessert of movement. Easy to carry, easy to warm, easy to share. It wasn't celebration. It wasn't joy. But it was enough. Could a handful of raisins carry you through winter? Follow for meal 6. It only got tougher from here. Number 6, mock chicken legs meat vanished, so they shaped the illusion. In war-era kitchens from the Midlands to Moldova, poultry was no longer part of daily life. It was a memory. Ration coupons didn't cover it. Markets didn't carry it. But hunger didn't care. So civilians made something that looked like meat, chewed like meat, and reminded the body what real food once felt like. They called it mock chicken legs. Some called it mock goose. But it was never about the bird, it was about resilience. The ingredients varied. Breadcrumbs were the base, dried from leftover crusts, ground by hand. These were mixed with mashed potatoes, shredded cabbage, lentils, or grated root vegetables. If meat was available, scrapings from a bone, ground liver, or leftover drippings, it was added. If not, seasoning had to carry the memory. Onion, mustard powder, black pepper. One egg, if available, bound the mixture. If not, water or flour paste substituted. The paste was shaped by hand into drumsticks, rough forms tapered at the end. Sometimes a stick or clean bone was inserted to mimic the leg. Each cut was rolled in flour or oats, then fried in shallow oil, if oil could be spared. Others baked them over firebrick ovens or in community kitchens. The result wasn't meat, but it was something to bite, something to hold. In Yugoslavia, Hungary, and parts of England, these meals became central, served on Sundays, used for holidays, or made quietly on days when the absence of meat became too loud. They were for morale as much as survival, a familiar shape in unfamiliar times. But these meals had limits. They lacked protein. They provided texture, not power. And without fat, they failed to sustain workers or soldiers. Still, for mothers feeding children without asking why there was no real meat, mock legs were the answer. They held form. They held warmth. They held dignity in kitchens where dignity had nearly vanished. And, for those who remembered the shape of comfort, even a crusted loaf in the shape of a drumstick could feel like defiance. What would you shape from nothing? One more wartime method comes next. Tap save. And remember what they never forgot. Number 7. Wartime vegetable casserole. When rations stopped arriving, they scraped the soil. No tins, no labels, no meat, just what could be pulled from ground before frost or confiscation. Carrots, leeks, onions, turnips, whatever survived in backyard plots, broken allotments, or abandoned fields. These became the building blocks of the only meal many civilians could rely on. Not stew, not soup, just heat, water, and roots. They called it hot pot. Others simply called it dinner. This dish had no fixed recipe, because nothing in war did. Housewives in Britain, displaced families in Poland, and farmers in Belgium made versions based on whatever they had. The common method began with boiling water, heated over coal bricks or open flame. Into it went chunks of root vegetables, chopped roughly, skins intact to preserve nutrients. A crumbling cabbage core, a sprouted onion, maybe half a parsnip, all were used. Nothing was discarded. There was no room for waste. If fat had been saved from previous meals, lard, dripping, or marrow, it was added to the pot, not for taste, for calories. In some households, stale bread crusts were stirred in to thicken the liquid. In others, dried herbs scavenged from hillsides gave the illusion of seasoning. In rare moments, a single bouillon cube was added, stored like treasure, rationed like gold. Cooking was slow, measured. The pot rarely boiled hard. It simmered in silence, lid on, fire low, so as not to waste fuel or draw attention. The smell filled the rooms like memory, not delicious, just real, just enough to say, there will be a meal tonight. When the casserole was done, it wasn't served in courses. It was ladled into bowls, whatever was available, metal tins, cracked mugs, chipped enamel. It wasn't pretty, but it was hot, and that mattered more. The limits were obvious. No protein, no fat reserves. It warmed, but didn't rebuild. Yet, for thousands of families, it was the difference between eating and watching others eat, between doing something and doing nothing. And for children, that bowl of orange and gray, carrot and turnip, root and skin, meant one thing. Someone still believed food was worth making. Would you recognize this as a meal or dismiss it too quickly? Save this skill. When systems fail, it's roots that keep us standing. Number 8. Norfolk Dumplings. When bread vanished, they boiled dough. No yeast, no oven, no firewood to spare. Just flour, if it could be found, and water from a nearby well. In eastern England and across ration-starved Europe, families replaced loaves with something simpler. Dumplings. Heavy, boiled, and unsweetened, these weren't comfort food. They were ballast, meant to fill space in the belly when there was nothing else to fill it with. Norfolk dumplings began with a basic mix: plain flour and water kneaded into thick dough. Some added salt, others stirred in powdered milk or leftover lard if they had it, but most didn't. The dough was rolled into balls or small slabs and boiled in salted water until firm. No rising agents, no shaping tools, just hands, steam, and hunger. Sometimes they were dropped straight into vegetable stew, absorbing the broth like sponges. Other times they were served dry, sliced and placed beside boiled cabbage or thinned gravy. In rare cases, a fried version was made with leftover fat, but that was a luxury. For most, boiling was the only fuel-efficient method. Their purpose wasn't taste, it was stretch. A ladle of thin soup could be made into a meal with just 2 dumplings. 1 handful of flour could feed 4 if divided carefully. In some regions, the dough was mixed with grated potato to reduce flour usage even further. That wasn't tradition. That was adaptation. But they had limits. They offered bulk, not balance. No vitamins, no protein. And over time, even children grew weary of their dense texture. But civilians kept making them because flour could still be bartered, because boiling didn't need precision, because every other option had disappeared. Norfolk dumplings weren't a dish. They were a tactic, a way to serve something warm, something shaped, something that said, "This is still a meal." Would you boil flour to outlast a crisis? Number 9. Cabbage and potato gravy meal. When kitchens collapsed, they cooked together. No firewood in homes, no supplies in pantries, no meat, no oil, not even salt in many cases. But across Britain, France, and scattered zones of resistance, civilians found one final method: communal meals. They gathered in makeshift dining halls, British restaurants, church basements, bomb shelters, and turned whatever they had into one pot. And most often that pot held cabbage and potatoes, and water thickened just enough to call it gravy. It started with what was available: cabbage, chopped coarse, and boiled hard. Potatoes, peeled only if the skins had rotted. Water, never wasted, was used to extract every nutrient. If onions or leek tops were present, they were thrown in for depth. If not, the starch carried its own weight, and then came the thickener, flour, if there was any. Crumbled bread, if it hadn't molded. Even mashed potato was stirred in to give the illusion of gravy. This wasn't served in private. It was scooped from vats, ladled into tin bowls or soldiers' mess kits. Meals were measured, not plated, designed to deliver 1/3 of the day's calories. Often, a small side of boiled barley or a spoon of stewed carrot was added, if stock allowed. But the main dish was always the same: cabbage softened to its core, potatoes broken into paste, and just enough liquid to call it a meal. It wasn't filling, it wasn't satisfying, but it was dependable. And for thousands, it was the only warm food they would receive all day. In the depths of rationing, these meals became ritual: lined queues, steam rising from pots, silence broken only by metal spoons against enamel. The limits were glaring: no fat, no protein, no resilience for cold. But the message mattered: you are not forgotten. In bombed cities and rural zones where stores no longer existed, these communal kitchens held the line. They taught families that even a spoonful of shared food was better than hunger in isolation. And when someone brought a small jar of herbs or a crust of saved lard, the whole pot changed. Just slightly. Just enough. What would you share when nothing's left to trade? Follow this final method. Survival was never a solo act. They didn't cook because they had enough. They cooked because there was no one left to ask. No delivery, no electricity, no supermarket light to flicker above a full shelf. Just hunger, waiting, and someone who remembered what to do next. These weren't meals made from choice. They were made from memory. Bent hands, peeling with cold, fires lit from scavenged branches. Boiling pots filled with root and hope. Nothing was wasted. Not water, not bread, not time. They stretched calories the way others stretch faith. Quietly, stubbornly, without guarantee. Because failure didn't mean hunger, it meant collapse. These meals weren't comfort food. They were food against collapse. Every recipe in this list wasn't written. It was repeated, hand to hand, stove to stove. From mothers who couldn't read but knew exactly how long cabbage takes to soften when the fire burns low. These weren't forgotten. We chose to forget, but memory remembers without permission. No cans, no preservatives, just survival. Crafted in silence, preserved in grit. The systems are fragile, but your hands are not, and neither were theirs.